"Devlin, come look at this," said Zaros Veltar, his six-eyed gaze fixed on the display in front of him. His voice had a flat, measured cadence, typical of someone accustomed to reading the universe's hidden patterns. The quiet hum of the station's lab echoed around the room, but it wasn't a peaceful sound. Something about the shift in the air made it feel almost too still. Captain Devlin Harker stepped forward, his boots clicking lightly against the metal floor of Outpost 387, a research station perched on the boundary of known space. The usual white lights above flickered in a rhythmic pattern, casting long shadows across the room as Harker leaned over Zaros's shoulder. A sense of unease crept into his gut, but he shoved it aside for the moment. The laser plasma display pulsed in front of them, showing a surge in gravitational data coming from the nearby black hole they had been monitoring for months. The numbers weren't right. They were all wrong. A subtle change, a pulse that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the black hole that had caused it, at least not in any way they had anticipated. It was something else. "Any idea what's causing this?" Harker's voice was steady, but it lacked its usual confidence. Zaros frowned, tapping his fingers against the control panel. "Unknown. No known stellar event or anomaly could cause a disturbance like this. We've never observed anything remotely close to this." His fingers flicked across the controls, adjusting variables, cross-checking data. His alien species had always been experts in astrophysics, and if he was concerned, Harker wasn't sure how to feel. "I've seen a lot in my years out here, but I've never seen anything like this," Harker muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. The isolation had already worn on him. The thought of some unknown force out there, in the dark, made his skin itch. The moment stretched. The data didn't lie. Something was shifting in the fabric of the galaxy itself. Harker's thoughts started to race, but before he could voice them, the display flickered. A massive, distorted wave ran through the black hole's surrounding space, its impact pulling at the edges of nearby star systems, bending light like a rippling fabric. Then, just as quickly, the disturbance seemed to fade. "Is that normal?" Harker asked, his voice tighter now. "No," Zaros said, the edge in his tone betraying his calm demeanor. "Not even remotely." He hesitated for a beat. This isn't just a natural event. There's something here." His fingers hovered over the console, as if not quite ready to acknowledge what it might mean. "We need to inform the rest of the crew." "This could be more than a simple fluctuation," Harker said, pulling his gaze away from the screen and turning to look at the rest of the station. The station was silent, but there was a subtle hum of activity in the background. The creak of metal, the low thrum of air recyclers, and the faint staccato of footsteps in the hallway were all sounds Harker had come to associate with Outpost 387. It had become home in a strange way, but this moment felt different. The air somehow felt heavier. The energy was shifting, charging. The team assembled in the central command room. Darren Tylos, the alien scientist with a keen interest in gravitational anomalies, was already there. He looked up from his display as Harker entered, and his sharp eyes met Harker's. His species was known for their ability to understand vast cosmic forces, but even he seemed unsettled. "What's going on?" Darren's voice cut through the quiet hum of the room. Harker looked at him, then at the others. Dr. Cale Torrin, the chief engineer, stood near the side, his hands buried in a toolkit. His role in this situation wasn't clear yet, but his expertise in station systems would prove useful soon enough. He didn't speak, but the uneasy glance he exchanged with Darren spoke volumes. "We're seeing strange readings from the black hole, and it's not natural," Harker said, his voice now carrying an edge of concern. Zaros quickly stepped forward, his multiple eyes blinking slowly as he ran through the data again. The words "massive energy spike" were written in bold across the screen. "Can't you adjust the sensors?" Harker asked, But he knew it wasn't that simple. They had already calibrated these sensors 1,000 times. They were precise, far more than anything on Earth. "I've run everything we can," Zaros said, clearly frustrated. "Whatever this is, it's not anything we've encountered before. We're not dealing with a natural anomaly. This feels different, more controlled, and it's coming from the black hole's core." Harker stood still for a moment, letting the implications settle. A controlled force coming from the black hole? That didn't add up, but before he could speak, the laser plasma displays across the room began flashing rapidly. Numbers shifted and twisted, rapidly accelerating in patterns Harker couldn't comprehend. "Look at that!" Darren pointed at a specific graph, his voice rising. Harker leaned in, squinting at the screen. For a moment he thought the image might be glitching, but the readings were real. "This is impossible," Dr. Toran muttered under his breath, crossing the room to join them. Harker turned sharply. "What are we looking at?" "It's a gravity pulse, but not from the black hole itself. The patterns, they're not random." Darren continued. This has to be something alive." The word hung in the air, thick with its weight. Something alive. The possibility slammed into Harker's chest like a punch. The black hole wasn't just an object of study anymore. It was a doorway to something far worse than they had anticipated. "Is there any way to know if it's a threat?" Harker asked, his tone sharpening. Before anyone could respond, the station's comms system came to life with a burst of static. "This is the Intergalactic Peace Council," a voice crackled. "We've reviewed your data. Our best astrophysicists believe this is just a fluke, a rare but harmless event. No immediate action is required." A cold fury sparked in Harker's chest. "Harmful or not, you're underestimating it. We need more resources now." But the line went dead, cutting him off. He stared at the console, hands clenched into fists. They were dismissing him, just like they had so many times before. "They're not taking this seriously, Harker," Zaros said, his voice low but firm. "We can't rely on them." Harker didn't need to hear more. The realization hit him like a cold slap. If they were going to survive, it would have to be on their own. "We're on our own," Harker muttered, already reaching for the hidden communication system that had been installed in case of emergencies. Earth's Defender fleet, built in secret during humanity's years of isolation, this was their only hope. As he began transmitting the call for help, a sharp buzzing echoed through the command room. The readings on the screens began to spike. Harker's heart raced. The Void Eaters weren't waiting for the galaxy's response. They were coming for them now. The transmission hummed to life as Captain Devlin Harker keyed in the final sequence of commands. His fingers trembled slightly, but his mind remained fixed on the task. The moment he hit send, the signal would ripple out through the dark, invisible space, reaching deep into humanity's hidden enclave, the Defender fleet. He'd never doubted it before, but now, with the weight of the entire galaxy on his shoulders, he could feel the significance of this moment more than ever. The risk was undeniable. If the fleet's encryption was compromised, every ship, every life aboard this station would be lost. Yet in the quiet of the command room, Harker pushed that thought aside. He had no other choice. A soft beep followed the confirmation as the transmission began its journey. The station's heads-up displays flickered briefly, but no immediate sign of interference surfaced. As he leaned back from the console, his mind tried to focus on the task ahead. Time was rapidly running out. He could feel it, an unease in the very air around him. Something was shifting. Zaros Veltar stood off to the side, arms crossed, his forearms flexing with nervous energy. "You've done it. Now we wait," he said quietly, his expression hard to read. The alien strategist, who had seen his fair share of war in the distant past, didn't look like a man preparing for peace. His eyes darted to the laser plasma displays, watching the readouts, still in disbelief. "We'll wait," Harker replied, though his voice was tight. The time for waiting was over. Their quiet station had just become a target. The Void Eaters were close now, their presence undeniable, but their true force had yet to fully show itself. The tension in the room thickened. Darren Tylos, the alien scientist who had spent countless hours analyzing cosmic phenomena, glanced uneasily at Harker. "You've sent the call," he said, "but I still don't believe this is the threat you think it is. A black hole's energy flares are notorious for triggering false readings. Could it not just be—" "No," Harker interrupted, his voice rising. "This is not a mistake, Darren. You saw the data yourself." He turned to face the others. "We've been watching this for weeks. The Void Eaters are real. They're coming." Darren shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "The Peace Council." "The Peace Council is blind," Harker spat. "Their arrogance is going to get us killed." The room fell silent. The weight of Harker's words hung heavy, but as if to punctuate them, the station's automated alarms blared suddenly, cutting through the tension. The alert flashed across the heads-up display. "Gravitational anomaly detected." Harker's heart skipped a beat. His eyes snapped to the plasma screens, and what he saw stopped him cold. The readings were off the scale, far beyond anything they had ever witnessed before. A massive surge in gravitational flux, so powerful it was distorting the surrounding stars. Something was moving toward them, something enormous. Zaros stepped forward, his sharp gaze piercing the data. "It's them. The Void Eaters have arrived." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of certain death. The walls of the station seemed to press inward. Dr. Cale Torrin, the chief engineer, ran to the control panel, tapping a series of commands. The station's gravity stabilizers were reacting wildly, struggling against the unseen force approaching. Harker could feel the subtle shaking of the station's foundation, the ever-so-slight tilt as the immense gravity waves rolled over the structure. It was like the station itself was being sucked into a black hole, its metal walls groaning under the strain. The moment the first Void Eater scout ship came into view, the entire station seemed to shudder. It was a grotesque thing, unlike anything Harker had ever seen. Massive, incomprehensibly large, and made of dark matter that seemed to warp around it, absorbing light. The ship's surface shimmered like a liquid void, and from within its core a pulsing glow that seemed to come from the very heart of space itself. "God!" whispered Darren, his voice trembling. Harker's eyes never left the screen. "Stay calm. Zaros, begin defensive preparations. We won't make it easy for them." He turned, his voice more commanding now. "Dr. Torrin, engage all emergency protocols. We're going to need every ounce of energy this station can muster. We won't survive if we don't fight." Zaros nodded sharply, moving toward the tactical control panel. His movements were swift, calculating, like a man used to seeing death on the horizon. Yet even he couldn't mask the doubt in his eyes. He knew their weapons weren't designed for this kind of fight. The Void Eaters were creatures of incomprehensible scale, with technology that defied anything the station had ever encountered. The station's primary weapon systems flickered to life, but the sight of the Void Eater scout ship barely registering the station's attempts to lock onto it was sobering. The scout ship moved like a shadow, too fast, too unpredictable. The only sign of its presence was the violent warping of space around it. "Their technology is beyond anything we've faced," Zaros muttered. He was adjusting the station's shields, but they flickered dangerously. "These shields won't last long against that level of energy." Harker clenched his fists. He wanted to shout, to give a command that could change the tides, but the grim reality of their situation suffocated him. It was then that the station's communication system crackled to life. The faint, distorted voice on the other side sent a wave of disbelief through the room. "Captain Harker," a familiar voice said, crackling through static. "This is Admiral Roan Vance, commander of the Defender Fleet. We received your transmission. We're en route." The tension in the room broke, but only for a moment. Darren's mouth hung open in shock. "You mean they actually came?" "They came," Harker said, a slow smile creeping onto his face. For the first time since the Void Eater's arrival, he allowed himself to believe in a sliver of hope. They came. As the Defender fleet emerged from the folds of hyperspace, the darkness was torn apart by their advanced, sleek warships, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The ships seemed to materialize from the void itself, long, angular forms glowing with unfamiliar energy. Admiral Vance's fleet was like a silent storm, with advanced disruptor cannons bristling on their flanks, weapons designed to cut through even the most formidable defenses. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the Void Eaters faltered. The ships didn't know what hit them. The human fleet's advanced energy weapons fired in perfect synchronization, punching holes in the scout ships' shields and tearing them apart in flashes of searing light. The Defender fleet didn't just fight. They overwhelmed the Void Eaters, forcing them into retreat. The balance of power began to shift. As the battle raged outside, the alien crew, once skeptical, now watched in awe. Their disbelief dissolved into action, and with Harker's guidance, they joined the fight, using every weapon, every system they could to help. But it was clear that the real fight had just begun. The first wave had fallen, but what came next was far more dangerous. Harker looked out at the debris floating in space, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "This isn't over," he said softly. "Not by a long shot." The room was silent, save for the faint clicking of fingers against console keys, as Admiral Roan Vance studied the incoming data. A shadow hung over his usually composed features, the weight of the task ahead sinking deeper with each passing minute. His face was set, lips tight, and his eyes narrowed in concentration. The Void Eaters had arrived in full force, and their initial defeat had only bought them time. The real war was about to begin. Captain Devlin Harker stood at the far side of the command center, a map of the galaxy projected on the laser plasma display in front of him. His hand hovered over the control panel, his mind calculating every potential outcome, every move the enemy might make. He knew this wasn't just about defending a single station anymore. This was about survival on a galactic scale. The Defender fleet was humanity's last hope, and they had to be ready. "Are we set?" Vance's voice was low, edged with anticipation. His demeanor might have been calm, but the faint tension beneath it was unmistakable. "We're ready," Harker replied, his voice steady but tinged with a sense of urgency. He knew, in the deepest part of his being, that if they failed here, the Void Eaters would not stop with Outpost 387. They would burn through every system, every planet, until nothing was left. The thought was like a knife twisting in his gut. Jax Reel, the tactician from the human fleet, stood by a secondary display, running his fingers over the sleek controls. "Our stealth technology is the key. We need to get close enough to strike, but we can't risk detection. They'll wipe us out the second they sense us." Harker nodded, his mind running through the possibilities. "We'll use the nebula on the edge of Sector 22 as cover. We'll launch a hit-and-run on their scouting ships. The Void Eaters may be enormous, but their peripheral ships are vulnerable. We need to neutralize their ability to scout." Jax's fingers moved rapidly over the console. "I'll configure the drones for maximum disruption. The Defender fleet's energy cannons can take out their smaller vessels in one shot, but we need to keep the big ships in the dark for as long as possible. We can't rely on just ambushes," Zeros Veltar added from across the room, his voice laced with urgency. "We need to target their hive mind, the core that controls them. Disrupting their communication will slow them down. Harker turned to face him, his eyes sharp. You're right. If we can sever their connection, even for a few minutes, we could gain the upper hand. The alien strategist's multi-limbed figure moved with precision as he tapped in his calculations. I've been analyzing their patterns, Captain. There's a rhythm to how they attack. If we time it right, we can create a gap in their defenses. We hit the heart of their system first, then we go for the smaller command vessels. Good, Harker said, turning back to the screen. He studied the rotating map, his mind fully immersed in the data. The Void Eaters' tactics were ruthless, but they were also predictable, and that in itself was their only vulnerability. If the Defender fleet struck first, they could shatter their command structure before the swarm descended upon them.
Is everyone clear on the plan? Harker asked, his voice cutting through the growing murmur in the room. Yes, Captain. Dr. Cullo Torin, the station's chief engineer, replied, his voice carrying the familiar calmness of someone who had spent years patching together broken systems. His eyes flicked to the displays, tracking the shifting energy signatures. We're coordinating the station's defense systems with the fleet's capabilities. The gravitational pulses will be our first line of defense. Once the fleet hits, we provide cover fire and reinforce the shields. The crew moved with purpose, each member instinctively falling into their assigned roles, readying themselves for the battle ahead. Harker could feel the collective energy in the room, the sense of imminent danger driving them forward. There was no more time for hesitation. The Void Eaters had made their move, and it was now or never. The first wave of Void Eater ships arrived like a tidal wave crashing against the galaxy's defenses. Their enormous shadowy forms seemed to blot out the stars themselves, their sheer presence warping space and time around them. The human fleet and the alien crew at Outpost 387 were ready, but it was clear from the first few moments that this battle would test them in ways they had never anticipated. The first blast was felt before it was seen, a deep pulsing tremor that rattled the entire station. The Void Eaters' weapons tore through space with a soundless fury, leaving trails of distortion in their wake. Harker's hands tightened into fists, but he remained calm, eyes fixed on the display as the energy shields around the station flickered under the assault. Brace for impact, Vance ordered, his voice crisp and commanding. Harker turned back to the screen, his mind working in overdrive. They couldn't hold out forever, but if they could keep the station intact long enough for the human fleet to break through, they stood a chance. Laser beams and energy blasts lit up the dark expanse, the station's defenses pushing back against the Void Eaters' initial attacks. But it was clear each moment counted. The Defender fleet's stealth ships darted in and out of the shadows, hitting the Void Eaters' scout ships with brutal precision. The battle erupted in a dazzling display of light and destruction as the human fleet tore through the enemy ranks, one ship after another. Harker's heart raced as he watched the destruction unfold. The Void Eaters retaliated quickly, launching counterattacks that shook the very core of the station. The crew's faces were set in grim determination, but there was no time to celebrate their victories, not when the real threat was still looming, an entire armada waiting to strike. Move into position, Harker ordered, his voice steady, despite the tension. Jax, give me a report on the energy output of their ships. Jax's voice came back over the comm, his tone measured but urgent. We're hitting them hard, Captain, but the big ships, their energy shields are beyond our capacity. We need to hit the core, disrupt their command system. Harker nodded. Then it's time for our final move. Uxaros, get ready to execute the breach. We take the heart and we finish this. The next moments passed in a blur. The station's weapon systems fired with relentless intensity, while the Defender fleet pushed forward, engaging in close-range combat. Harker's fingers flew over the controls as he helped coordinate the final assault. It was now or never. The Void Eaters were fighting with all their might, but Harker and his crew had one advantage: human ingenuity. As the battle raged outside, the Void Eater command ship appeared in the distance. Its size was unimaginable, a monstrous entity of raw power, but it had one weakness: its control center. If they could break through that, they could collapse the entire fleet. Take the shot, Harker commanded, his voice calm but resolute. The Defender fleet launched a volley of energy disruptors, aimed directly at the command ship. The explosion that followed lit up the sky, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The Void Eater's fleet faltered for just a moment. It was enough. Harker's mind raced as he watched the disarray unfold. The Void Eaters, once a force of overwhelming power, were now scrambling. They had lost their hive mind, their central control, and the human fleet pressed the advantage. Harker could only watch as the battle surged forward. His hands trembled slightly, but his heart was clear. This was the turning point. The stand had begun, and they were finally making their mark. "Keep pushing," Harker muttered, barely audible over the roar of the battle. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." As the Void Eaters regrouped, Harker knew that they had crossed a threshold. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. "Target their flanks," Admiral Roan Vance commanded. His voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. The Void Eater armada loomed before them, a tidal wave of destruction, each ship a mountain of shifting darkness. Their size was overwhelming, their firepower unimaginable. But Admiral Vance knew they had the upper hand, at least for now. They had been playing a dangerous game since the first strike, dancing on the edge of annihilation, and the human fleet had been biding its time. Now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The laser plasma displays in the command room flickered as they updated with real-time data from the fleet's front lines. The hum of commands and shifting tactics filled the space, each officer absorbed in their own vital task. Jax Reshril, the fleet's strategist, stood with his eyes locked on the ever-evolving battlefield. He didn't flinch as explosions lit up the void outside, sending ripples through the station's defensive shields. The Void Eater ships weren't going down without a fight. "Take out their smaller vessels first. We need to cripple their advance," Reshril said, his words cutting through the tense atmosphere. "They can't get through if we disrupt their command structure." Harker's fingers danced over the controls as he keyed in the next set of commands. The Defender Fleet's ships glided through the battlefield, sleek and agile, using stealth to close in on the enemy's weaker points. The Void Eaters, slow and massive, responded with brute force, but they weren't prepared for the human fleet's deceptive tactics. The human ships, smaller but faster, darted in and out of range, taking out the Void Eater scouts before retreating back into the nebulous shadows, using the environment to their advantage. "Hit them hard, hit them fast," Vance had said earlier, and the human fleet executed the strategy with precision. For every Void Eater ship that fell, two more took its place, their relentless assault barely slowing, but the tide was beginning to turn. The Void Eaters had no way to predict these rapid, unpredictable movements. The Defender Fleet's hit-and-run tactics were shaking their confidence. Exaros Veltar, standing by Harker's side, spoke without turning away from the laser plasma display. "Their swarm tactics are overwhelming. We'll need to focus on their control center if we're going to shift the balance." Harker nodded, his mind racing. It was clear the Void Eaters' strength lay in their coordination, in their hive mind. They had to cut that connection. Disrupting their leadership, breaking their link would be the only way to break their momentum. "Dr. Torin," Harker called, his voice urgent. "How are our energy reserves holding up?" "We're running low," Torin replied, his hands flying over the control panel. "We can't keep this up for long without more power, but we've reconfigured some of the station's systems to feed into the fleet's main weapons array. We should have enough for one final push." "One push then," Harker muttered. "Let's make it count." With the alien crew's help, the station's systems had been modified to support the fleet's weapons, creating a network of energy that would give them the firepower they needed to strike a decisive blow. The plan was risky, but it was the only one they had. "Focus everything on the Void Eater command ship," Harker ordered. "Once we disable their leadership, the swarm will collapse." The Void Eater's massive flagship, a looming leviathan of dark matter and chaotic energy, was a hulking beast, seemingly impervious to the barrage of attacks being hurled at it. Its shields shimmered, a vast and impenetrable wall, but Harker knew that walls could be breached. The key was coordination, striking when the enemy was weakest. The Defender Fleet adjusted their position, the ships forming a tight circle around the flagship, ready to deliver the final blow. The Void Eaters retaliated fiercely, their massive weapons tearing into the human fleet's smaller ships, but the Defender Fleet held firm, sacrificing smaller vessels to create the opportunity for the decisive strike. Ready? Vance's voice crackled through Harker's earpiece. Ready, Harker responded, his hands steady as he issued the final command. A series of energy pulses rippled out from the human fleet, converging on the Void Eater flagship. The station's additional power was channeled through a direct link, creating a surge of destructive energy that blasted into the enemy's shields. The Void Eater's flagship reeled, its protective barriers flickering in and out, but it wasn't enough to stop the human assault. With coordinated precision, the fleet's ships released their full firepower. The first wave of attacks hit the flagship's core, destabilizing its shields, and a second wave tore into its main energy conduit, cutting off its ability to communicate with the rest of the fleet. The Void Eater's response was immediate, but it was too late. With their central command severed, their forces faltered. Confused, their massive armada, once an unstoppable force, suddenly found itself in disarray. Ships turned erratically, breaking formation, and their attacks became frantic, uncoordinated. The human fleet pressed on, taking full advantage of the chaos. Disrupt their remaining scouts, Jax Reel shouted, as the remaining Void Eater ships attempted to regroup. We've broken their command. They're finished. The human fleet, now united and resolute, struck with everything they had. Energy beams from the human ships sliced through the remaining Void Eater scouts, obliterating them with ruthless efficiency. The tide had shifted completely, and the Void Eaters were on the retreat. As the final Void Eater scout ship disintegrated, a heavy silence fell over the battlefield. The remaining Void Eater vessels, leaderless and in disarray, began to pull away, retreating into the void. They had lost their grip on the galaxy. Their advance had ended. Victory, Harker whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. His fingers hovered over the control panel, the realization settling in slowly. They had done it. Against all odds, they had pushed back the darkness. The Defender fleet remained in position, their ships floating in the void like a beacon of light. The alien crew at Outpost 387 stood in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on the human fleet. I never thought I'd see this day, Ixaros said quietly, his voice filled with awe. The Void Eaters have always been considered a myth. But now, Harker exhaled deeply. It's over, but it's not the end. The galaxy won't forget this. As the Defender fleet began to regroup, the human fleet's victory over the Void Eater armada marked the beginning of a new chapter. The tides of war had shifted, and Earth had proven that they were not just survivors, but leaders. The Void Eaters, once thought to be invincible, had been brought to their knees. For the first time in a long while, Harker allowed himself to relax. The battle was over. The war had been won, and humanity, though scarred, stood ready for the challenges ahead. The last remnants of the Void Eater fleet disappeared into the distance, their dark forms vanishing into the abyss. For a moment, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The once overwhelming presence of the alien armada had crumbled into dust, leaving only the wreckage of their shattered ships floating in the cold expanse. The Defender fleet, though battered, stood triumphant, their ships flickering with residual energy, as if still processing the overwhelming battle that had just unfolded. The human fleet had won, but Captain Devlin Harker did not share in the triumph. His eyes remained fixed on the stars, the silence now deafening. It wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of something far more ominous, something that only he and a few others could fully comprehend. The battle for the galaxy was over, but the scars left behind would linger for much longer. The victory was not without its cost. Do you believe it? Ixaros Volatar asked, his voice breaking the silence. The alien strategist stepped beside Harker, his multi-limbed frame casting a long shadow on the observation deck. No, Harker replied, his voice rough. He didn't take his eyes off the stars. It's not over, not yet. Ixaros didn't press. He had learned in his years of battle that sometimes the greatest fights are the ones fought within, the ones that are never fully won. The galaxy had changed, but that change came at the expense of everything they had known. The Defender fleet had crippled the Void Eater forces, their core severed, yet the true cost of this battle stretched far beyond the death of a single enemy. The galactic balance had been broken, and humanity's place in the universe had been irrevocably altered. What was once a quiet, isolated species now stood at the center of a new era, one that they had not asked for but could no longer avoid. Admiral Roan Vance stood at the front of the bridge, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, as if the weight of command was now heavier than it had ever been. His face, usually stern and decisive, was drawn with a weariness that came from fighting wars far from home. It wasn't the victory he had hoped for, but it was the one they had earned. He turned to face Harker, his eyes sharp but thoughtful. "We've done it. The Void Eaters are broken, but I know there's more weighing on you than this. You've seen it, haven't you?" Vance's voice wasn't a question. It was an understanding. "The galaxy's different now. We've taken their power. But now, we're the ones with it." Harker nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "We've proven what we can do. The Void Eaters have awakened something far more dangerous than their ships. They've awakened the idea that power is no longer in the hands of the old empires. The Intergalactic Peace Council would never be the same again. Their complacency in peace had led to their near annihilation at the hands of the Void Eaters. But it wasn't just their incompetence that had nearly doomed them. It was the galaxy's own fragility, the illusion that peace could last forever. It was an illusion that Earth, in its quiet isolation, had seen through long before anyone else. Everything we've fought for, everything we've lost, has brought us here. The question now is, what do we do with it? Harker's voice was hard, and as he spoke, the tension of his decision settled into the pit of his stomach. Exaros stepped forward, his 8 eyes narrowing as he looked out into the abyss. "The galaxy will never be the same, but you, Captain, have done something no one else dared. You've saved us." "We didn't just save ourselves, Saros," Harker replied. His eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to scorch the very space between them. "We've shifted the power. The balance has tipped. They'll never see it coming, but humanity's fleets will rise. We'll no longer be a bystander to galactic history. The Defender fleet isn't just a force to protect Earth anymore. It's the foundation for a new age." His words hung in the air, the weight of them settling like a storm cloud overhead. The crew of Outpost 387, the alien scientists and engineers who had once doubted humanity's capacity for survival, now looked at each other with a mixture of awe and fear. They had fought alongside humans, and they had witnessed something no one in the galaxy would ever forget: the strength of a species that had been underestimated for far too long. Vance stepped up to Harker, his boots clicking sharply against the metal floor. "And what of the other species?" he asked. "What about the rest of the galaxy? Will they accept us?" Harker turned toward him, his expression hardening. "They will have no choice. When the Concord sends their representatives to Earth, they will come on our terms, not theirs. We've given them a choice: join us or stand aside. But if they stand in our way, we'll make it clear what happens next." He didn't say it with malice, but with certainty. The Defender fleet was not a symbol of power. It was a symbol of survival, of defiance. A signal that humanity would no longer allow themselves to be confined to the role of a side note in galactic affairs. It was a warning to every race, every faction, and every empire that had grown too complacent. Humanity would stand as equals, or better yet, as rulers. The decision wasn't easy, but it was the only one left. The old order was dead, the new one had just begun. Dr. Kale Torin came up beside them, her hands clasped behind her back. "The Void Eaters may be gone, but the ripple effects have just begun. Their disappearance is a power vacuum. We'll need to be vigilant. There are other forces out there, forces that won't hesitate to seize control now that the old systems are fractured." Harker nodded again, his gaze turning inward. "We'll prepare, and when the time comes, we'll show them what humanity is capable of." The stars outside the observation deck shimmered, cold and distant, as the Defender fleet floated in the stillness. The battle had been won, but the war had just begun. Humanity had proven it could rise from the ashes of the old world, unyielding, and now it was time for them to shape their future, to become more than just survivors. "We've earned our place," Harker said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Now we take it." As the human fleet maneuvered in the distance, forming a perfect circle around the remains of the Void Eater command ship, a new truth settled across the galaxy. The Void Eaters had been defeated, but their legacy, the lesson they had taught, would resonate for millennia. The universe had learned one undeniable fact: humanity would no longer be ignored, and when they had no other choice but to fight, they would not only survive, they would dominate. The stars were no longer the domain of those who held power by birthright. but of those who had the will to fight for it. The galaxy had felt the weight of humanity's hand, and it would never be the same. For the first time, humanity stood on its own, and the rest of the galaxy would have to decide, would they stand beside them or be swept aside in the wake of their rise? The final desperate call had not only summoned humanity's fleet, but had ignited the spark that would forever change the course of history.